head of the country's central bank floated the idea of dumping the greenback as the world's reserve currency, replacing it with an international currency.
Thousands of people gathered to hear Barack Obama deliver key foreign policy speech on his current European tour. His vision for America's place in a new world order.
Returning vets could be a risk to our nation.
We've got to give them a stake in creating the kind of world order that I think all of us would like to see.
And one of the ways it will drive the change is through global governance.
I think a new world order is emerging.
This is a hoax and a scam which is designed to transfer wealth and power from the private sector to the government sector and from the government of the United States to a world government.
And those people who have been yelling, oh, the UN's going to take over global
conspiracy theorists.
They've been crazy, but now they're right.
And who got the money? Hundreds and hundreds of banks. Any bank that has access to the U.S. Federal Reserve's discount.
Tell us who they are.
No.
You know, financial terrorism. They have the ability to tweak the knob.
I am proposing that the Federal Reserve be granted new authority.
The ultimate goal of the carbon tax and the cap and trade is to destroy production.
This energy tax is the largest tax increase in American history.
We're actually creating a global warming police. So number one, they can come in, the federal government can come in and inspect your house and send you the bill. We're setting up a global warming Gestapo.
And one of the things that if you talk to our generals, they are desperate for is a civilian counterpart to our military forces.
I am fierce.
And this is what I wear.
Senator Barack Obama's presidential campaign is asking Missouri law enforcement to target anyone who lies or runs a misleading television ad.
I've now been in 57 states. I think one left to go.
The president, when he was in Europe last week, he met with the king of Saudi Arabia. He appeared to bow.
President Obama today proposed something new, something called prolonged detention. Pre-crime is where people are arrested and incarcerated to prevent crimes that they have not yet committed.
It's the World Wrestling Federation. It's the Washington Wrestling Federation. They put on this show that they're bitter rivalries, you know, villains, and they really don't like each other. But behind closed doors, they buddy up for a drink and make deals.
Both the Republican and Democratic parties are owned by the same global elites. And on issues that matter to those global elites, they act as one.
They've wrapped themselves in the American flag, and they've talked about preserving American heritage and principles, and all the while they're working to merge us into a new world order where our sovereignty will be destroyed. We'll lose all connection with our American heritage.
With Bush, you knew exactly what you were getting. It was there was no iron fist in a velvet glove. It was just the iron fist. Whereas with Obama, you've got the velvet glove and the iron fist. You know, a very sharp guy, very smooth, knows exactly what he's doing. For that reason, far more dangerous than Bush.
Well, at the end of last year, I was willing to give Obama the benefit of the doubt. I thought it was premature to write this guy off. But now that he's been in office for a while, it's obvious that he is very tight with the Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan's on Wall Street, and he is extremely compliant and pliant to the wishes of the large banks, going back to what we saw with Robert Rubin under the Clinton administration, changing laws in favor of the banks. And he's not doing anything to stop the banks. He's helping the banks continue to do what they were doing under Bush. So in fact, he's just a continuation of Bush on the subject of markets and finance, which is the most important part of his policy right now.
People who voted for Obama wanted real change, and they're getting platitudes, they're getting a lot of nice talk, but nothing in the way of concrete change is taking place. In this town, business as usual.
There's one puppet master that controls the left, and there's the same puppet master controls the right. They control the Republican Party, and they control the Democratic Party.
This is not a party issue. This is not a left-right issue. The question is, who should government serve? And it should serve the people.
In fact, government is just a tool of the dominant minority that uses economics and government law to enforce upon the public various mandates.
The right-left paradigm in the U.S. and in U.S. politics is taken directly from the commercial world and the corporate world. In the business world, you have Coke, Pepsi, you have McDonald's, Burger King, you've got AT&T and Verizon, you've got duopolies. And a duopoly gives the illusion of there being some competition and some choice. And it looks a little bit better than a monopoly. So, for example, in communist Russia, if they had communist Russia red and communist Russia chartreuse, there would have been the illusion of choice and something akin to democracy in Russia. But they simply said, forget it, we're just going to go with red. In the US, they have this left-right paradigm, which unfortunately, it doesn't take them out of the hard, cold fact that there is no choice. There's no social justice. There's only one choice, which is to supply more rent to the rent seekers who have now taken the whole system hostage.
We've seen the limitations on government whittled away. We have seen this erosion to the point where today it seems like nobody does care. And right now in Washington, D.C., we have seen a fall of the republic.
If the United States doesn't have its Bill of Rights and Constitution, it doesn't exist anymore. It's just more real estate, more dirt. And that's what these global corporatists want. They want to completely dismantle the Bill of Rights and Constitution, and they're doing that right now. This is the fall of the republic. Our nation is dying. We, the people that live in this fine country, need to stand up, get involved, and take the system back. It's the Bill of Rights and Constitution that we owe allegiance to, not to a political party, and not to politicians that wrap themselves in the red, white, and blue, while at the same time they destroy everything that sacred flag stands for.
So in the old days, you used to have this globe that with 180 some odd countries, and a few of those countries had a lot of power, like the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States at various times. But today, you might better look at that globe and say that it's surrounded by huge clouds swirling around the planet. They know no national boundaries. They don't follow any specific sets of laws, and these are the big corporations. They basically control politicians around the world because they have all the money, and politicians always need money to get elected or to run their governments if they're not democratically elected politicians. They control the mainstream press, either through outright ownership or advertising budgets. They have massive amounts of lobbyists in Washington that have tremendous influence on our president and Congress. And they really are calling the shots. They form partnerships with the Chinese and the Taiwanese and the Tibetans, or with the Israelis and Arab nations, with Brazilians and Indians, with whatever country and whatever group of people has resources that they covet. And so for the first time in history, we really have this new form of an empire.
Barack Obama is a puppet of the New World Order to bring in a World Bank, to destroy the economy of this country, and to bring in global governance. And no matter how likable the fellow is, we as citizens of this country need to stand up and say no.
We have to stand up to preserve a republic here and a rule of law, which is under dire threat.
We don't want to live under a world government of the corporations, by the corporations, and for the corporations.
I don't want to believe it, and that's probably what holds me back on it, but I'm certainly seeing enough indication that it could be true. Absolutely, because they're always talking about Mexico and the United States and Canada ending up like Europe. And there's things done politically that seem to take us in that direction. And so I think it's incumbent upon all of us as American citizens to pay attention.
This move to world government is not about roses and happiness and peace and in a better life. It's about enslavement.
They said in their own writings, from the earliest times to the present, the world they're bringing in is to be a world where everyone who is born, or would be allowed to be born, would be born to serve the state. That would be their sole function. That's if they had a job for you to fulfill or a need for you.
July 4th, 2009. Across the United States, citizens gathered to celebrate the Republic's founding 233 years before. Most people in the crowds were aware that America was going in the wrong direction, that things were changing for the worse. But few could grasp the sheer magnitude of corruption and looting running rampant like a disease through the heart of the nation. The engine of America's greatness is not just its liberties, but the people's willingness to fight to keep them. Hundreds of other nations have had much larger populations and greater resources, but have never produced 1/10 of the wealth, science, and art that the United States has. Why?
In America, you had an amazing situation because you had the founding fathers who figured out that they could deconstruct the monarchy in such a way and then reproduce it with the three primary branches of government in a way that would create checks and balances and separation of powers. So you could have room, therefore, for individuals to work within the context of a cooperative, which is a democratic system of government, but it would still have enough room for individuals to rise up and become profitable and self-sustaining and rich in the pursuit of happiness without becoming dictatorial. But unfortunately, over the years, since all of those separation of powers have been cut away, and all of the beautiful design by the founding fathers has been co-opted by one corporate entity, one corporate communist entity, you don't have that anymore. So what we have, we're back to where we were before the revolution. You have one monolithic state.
For the first 100 years or so of the United States, after the 1700s, when we freed ourselves from British rule, no corporation was given a charter in the United States unless it served the public good. It had to prove that. And then its charter only lasted for 10 years, or sometimes as long as the project to build a bridge or a canal or something lasted. But it had to be up for review, and it could only get charters if it was shown that it was serving the public interest. That changed, primarily because John D. Rockefeller kind of bribed Delaware and New Jersey to begin with into accepting a different system where he said, listen, if I pay you lots of money in terms of taxes, etc., I want to be licensed and not have to serve the public good. I want to be able to get around that law. And state after state after state changed at that point.
In the United States, our Constitution and Bill of Rights recognizes that individuals have innate freedoms that can never be taken away by any government. For the first time in history, the people were unbound to reach for their full potential, producing and outcompeting every other nation on earth. The rights of free speech, self-defense, private property, due process of law, and many others ignited a revolution in human development that threatened the despotic rule of monarchs and tyrants worldwide. But the corrupt elites had studied history. They knew that great civilizations could only fall from within.
They know from previous experience and history that civilizations come and go and dwindle. They know the reasons why they come and go.
Isn't the only hope for the planet that the industrialized civilizations collapse? Isn't it our responsibility to bring that about? Morty Strong, founder of the UN Environment Program, from his opening speech, Rio Earth Summit, 1992.
Morty Strong is the man who said that they would never allow another country to rise up as powerful as America. It will never be allowed to happen again. And he said the best thing we can do is to tear down all the factories, all the top commerce of the United States, and level it and give it back to nature. So that was the advice from this character, who has tremendous power at the United Nations and was picked up and groomed by Rockefeller himself.
Over the past decades, since the Kennedy assassination approximately, you've had an ongoing oligarchical transformation of virtually every country in the world. And in the United States, it's taken the form of an oligarchical counter-revolution against the reforms of the 1930s, with the Wall Street interest asserting itself as more and more dominant. And once bankers and oligarchs have power, the things that they do, you could call them a policy. You could call it something like a tropism. It's like the way a plant responds. Naturally, since they're oligarchs, they're going to try to downgrade the standard of living of the vast majority of the population. They're going to claim that the world is overpopulated, that industrialization, industrial pollution, and overpopulation are the main problems that face the world. And they're generally going to try to crush and mortify any kind of popular democracy or mass movements with any kind of progressive content.
Nations rise and fall. They knew how debt could never be recuperated. They knew that disease or prolonged war could wipe out the population and the future populations that pay off debt. So these guys all work together. That's why it's no surprise that today you have Lord Rothschild coming out pushing the latest scam or religion that we must all believe in, which is global warming, which his personal bank, his family's bank in Switzerland, will be in charge of. They've run the system, the whole economic system of the world for the last 250 years. So why shouldn't they also run the economic system for the next few hundred years?
The question of a ruling class, oligarchy as a ruling class, is posed by Plato in the Republic, where we find that oligarchy is a constitution full of many evils, where the rich dominate the government by buying it, and the average individual or the poor count for absolutely nothing. Oligarchy is a frame of mind. In other words, if you're a banker, this is already a worldview. It's a world outlook, and it implies the policies that have got us here, right? Malthusian policies, zero growth policies, driving down the standard of living, attempts to wipe out all kinds of mass institutions that might be a countervailing force.
This is a scientific dictatorship, which Bertrand Russell said, and the Huxleys said, both Aldous and Julian Huxley said they would bring in the scientifically controlled society. It's not just family planning, which really means abortion and so on. It's global planning, which is literally sterilization and abortion worldwide for the ideal reduced society, and not just across the board, through genetics, through the Genome Project, through the constant IQ testing.
Globalization has economically destroyed the world. You've got at least 40 to 50,000 people who die every day worldwide from starvation, malnutrition, and diseases which can be cured for pennies, such as diarrhea. And if you ask one of these Malthusian oligarchs, don't you think that something should be done to raise the standard of living in Africa or South Asia? They'll say, no, we can't do that. That would wound the planet. That would oppress Mother Earth. So that's oligarchy. Class consciousness in this sense is absolutely essential. If you think that bankers are the same as you, you're wrong. F. Scott Fitzgerald once told Hemingway, you know, the rich are different from us. And Hemingway said, yeah, they have more money. And F. Scott Fitzgerald replied, no, it's something much deeper. It's a whole different world. To be an oligarch, to be a Rockefeller or something of this sort, means that you're in a completely different world with values which are the reverse of human values. Now, if you allow the oligarchs to continue to dominate, the destruction of world civilization is a matter of a few decades at the very, very most. So, choose.
To force their agenda through, the elites are employing one of their favorite tools, artificial crisis creation, also known as the Hegelian dialectic of problem-reaction-solution.
You never want a serious crisis to go to waste. And what I mean by that, it's an opportunity to do things that you think you could not do before.
The Earth's ruling elite are first and foremost monopoly men. The founder of the Rockefeller clan summed it up simply when he said, competition is a sin.
Rockefeller himself said that competition was a sin. And people quipped at that, thinking it was one of his little jokes. He made many jokes about saving pennies and stuff like this. But in reality, he was telling you a truth, that competition to a man like him, who worked for a much larger organization, competition truly was a sin. And The cartels have been formed ever since, have become much bigger, more powerful. Cartels which can literally command governments, sometimes to go to war on their behalf, have occurred.
The economic crash of 2008 and 2009 was an engineered crisis designed to cripple sovereign nations globally to make way for a world currency and a new bank of the world.
China's holding what, 1.5 trillion worth all over the world. They're holding U.S. currencies. They want to get out of them in a way where they're not going to lose on their investments. There's going to be a world currency. There's going to be a new reserve currency. They're going to push it through the IMF. That's going to be the banksters that are going to be in charge of it. It's going to happen, and it's going to happen sooner rather than later.
There was also a question to Geithner. Do you think that the U.S. dollar ought to be replaced? And he blew it. He had a moment of candor where he said, yeah, we're considering that. So on that day, the dollar went down 1% within a couple of minutes.
Chinese government proposal about a global currency and about the IMF regulations, the new IMF idea about the general agreements to borrow and having a faster ability to disperse to the emerging markets. As I understand this proposal, it's a proposal designed to increase the use of the IMF's special drawing rights. We're actually quite open to that suggestion.
Timothy Geithner's comment about global currency is not off the table because it's not off the table and it's going to come. The whole world is ready to bail out of bucks. They just want to do it in a way where they're not going to lose on their investments. That's all that's going on.
All the people around the world, the Japanese who have $1 trillion, the Chinese who have $1 trillion, the Saudis have $1 trillion, the Europeans something similar, they're all going to dump it at the same time. The rush for the exits. And that will then create hyperinflation.
When America finishes supplying the manpower and the military for standardization of the world into the one system, and they want a secular world society with a hint of greening and Gia worship for sustainability reasons. America, as they're finishing off this agenda, they'll be pulling the rug from underneath Americans at home at the same time towards the latter stages.
When the dollar starts to slide, and this was always the nightmare of Paul Adolph Volcker, who is now sitting in the Obama White House, once the dollar starts to go, there's nothing to stop it. There's no useful way that you can stop it once it begins to gather momentum. So I think we're facing the probability of some form of dollar panic combined with hyperinflation sometime during the Obama presidency.
They're now pulling the rug away from under the feet of the people. They're becoming rapidly a non-manufacturing country. Any country that can't manufacture its own goods, even for self-defense, therefore is no longer sovereign, independent, and able to sustain itself, which tells you that this is all part of the plan.
It started with the very beginning when you established that there was a Federal Reserve System given the power of the state to create money out of nothing and to do so without any regard to the will of the people, without any regard to what's behind the money system. In other words, strictly political and economic motives for the bankers and the politicians. Once you granted that power to a group, the Federal Reserve System, the economic crisis was inevitable. This has happened before. Every time in history when the government was given the power, or a group of banks in conjunction with the government was given the power to expand the money supply at will, those economic systems always wound up in crisis and always collapsed. So there's no reason to believe that the United States was given some kind of a get-out-of-jail-free card, an exemption from the processes of history. So the economic crisis began at the very beginning, and as a matter of fact, when the founders of the Federal Reserve System met on Jekyll Island back in 1910 and were drafting the Federal Reserve Act, one of the things they discussed was how to pass on the inevitable losses to the taxpayers. They knew that inevitably something like this would happen, and they knew that there had to be some way to get out of it without destroying the banks, of course, because they were the banks. And they said, aha, we'll go into partnership with the government, we'll take our cartel agreement and pass it into law, call it the Federal Reserve Act, and we'll make the taxpayer come online and be responsible to bail us out if and when the failure finally comes.
Who's going to soak up the derivatives? Who's going to soak up the debt? Who's going to be penalized? And right now, it looks like Wall Street's getting bailed out, and the little guy in the middle of Main Street America are all going to pay the penalty.
Can the economy be turning around here? Are happy days here again? And can we actually have growth without jobs? Is this an oxymoron, jobless recovery?
We're going into the greatest depression. There will be no job growth. Unemployment will continue to escalate. Along with it, so too will crime, poverty, kidnappings, boss snappings. And the more things spin out of control, the harder the hammer is going to come down by the federal government to keep everyone in control.
Power is much, much more important to them than money is. Money is only a way to the means. Power is the end result.
The elite's main goal is to destroy national sovereignty and individual independence. To consolidate their grip on power, the banksters create artificial debt bubbles that are mathematically impossible to pay back.
These are those sinister, toxic assets, the complex financial instruments that they talk about but never really name. They're paper based on paper. They're credit default swaps, collateralized debt obligations, mortgage-backed securities, asset-backed securities, structured investment vehicles, auction rate securities, and so on down the line. It's an immense mass of cancerous, fictitious, speculative paper, bloated in value, impossible to bail out. Triage the derivatives on their books. There's no way to bail out a $1.5 quadrillion black hole of derivatives, but nevertheless they tried.
The Wall Street cronies are crooks. If you leave the vault to the bank open, these people are going to help themselves. The job of the government is to make sure there's somebody there to make sure the vault is closed, and very few people have the combination.
I'm William K. Black, Associate Professor of Economics and Law at the University of Missouri at Kansas City. I was a senior regulator in a number of different positions during the heart of the savings and loan crisis. On a staff level, I led the re-regulation of the savings and loan industry. The purpose of regulation and effective criminal prosecution is to make sure that cheaters don't prosper, that honest manufacturers win in competition. The primary driver of the current crisis is accounting control fraud. These are frauds led by the CEOs of the major lending institutions and major banks and institutional buyers of toxic waste product. How did it start? It started with mortgages, particularly non-prime mortgages. In September of 2004, the FBI warned that there was an epidemic of mortgage fraud, their words, and that this epidemic of mortgage fraud would cause an economic crisis at least as large as the savings and loan debacle if it wasn't stopped. The FBI found that 80% of the mortgage fraud was being induced by the lenders, not by the borrowers. You know, much of the rage has been against the borrowers, but if you want rage, it should be at the CEOs who became fabulously wealthy by following a strategy based on fraud.
The Wall Street people and their friends here at the Federal Reserve and at the U.S. Treasury and down the Washington Mall here at the U.S. Capitol. That's where the damage was done, and if people want to vent their anger, they need to vent it against these people.
Between the Bush-Paulson administration and the Obama, Summers, Geithner, Volcker administration, there's really a total continuity of economic and financial policy.
Geithner was on board at the Fed, the New York Fed, dealing with all these institutions. He didn't get it. And then we had this fellow who came up afterward, Mr. Friedman. He was on the Goldman Sachs board, and he didn't last too long as a Fed chairman. Why? Because he had a conflict of interest. Is it possible that there's so much conflict of interest here that all you folks don't even realize that you're helping people that you're associated with, and you should be recusing yourself for America's ethics?
I behaved with the...
You don't think you should have recused yourself when you asked Lehman to go in bankruptcy, you didn't put Bear Stearns in bankruptcy, and then you folded Merrill Lynch into... I mean, isn't there some point where you got to say, hey, I got a conflict of interest here? You don't feel any kind of scintilla of ethics on this thing at all?
Totally. I operated very consistently within the ethic guidelines I had as Secretary of the Treasury, and when it became clear that we had some very significant issues with Goldman Sachs and with
why didn't you recuse yourself
with Morgan Stanley, what I did then, it would have been very wrong for me to recuse myself. What I did was I went and got a waiver from the ethics agreement, because when we had concerns...
Who is in charge of the ethics agreement?
What?
Who's in charge of the ethics agreement that you got a waiver?
We have a Office of Ethics at Treasury, and we have a White House ethics office.
So you got it from the legal counsel from the White House?
We got it from the government ethics office.
So we had Snow, we had Paulson, now we have Geithner. All these people cut from the same bowl of cloth. These are not independent Treasury secretaries. They're part of the problem, not part of any solution. And it would have been nice to see President Obama effect some change in Treasury, but of course, he went and got a Wall Street insider as his Treasury Secretary.
Everything that's speculative, parasitical, cancerous, bloated from all these administrations, going back to Carter and even beyond, comes together in the Obama administration. With Volcker, with Summers, who's part of the economic crimes under Clinton, the guy who brought you derivatives and the abolition of the Glass-Steagall firewall.
You could not have gotten a more perfect setup for a takeover from a previous government, the Bush regime, than the Obama regime. Now, there are some authors out there already saying that it's the same bunch, and it's true. It's the same bankers who put the same boys forward. Obama, far from helping the public and giving them something new or giving them more power and say over their own affairs, has actually sided immediately with the bankers who once again have robbed the public blind, and now they must get bailed out by your tax money.
Obama does it all with left cover. He makes you think that he's somehow different from Bush, that this is somehow benevolent, that he cares about the poor. And in reality, this is the cruelest hoax and the most bogus sham. Obama is 1,000% devoted to Wall Street interests. When Wall Street says jump, Obama jumps. And again, it's about $30 to $40 for the bankers for every dollar that ever reaches an unemployed person or somebody who's on food stamps or some infrastructure building for highways.
The hope with the Obama administration was that it would move us beyond this. But unfortunately, what we're seeing more and more is that Obama has brought in many of the economists who bought into the system in the past. Larry Summers is a very good example. And so many of his economists, many of the people there, you can really almost at this point relate Obama to Hoover, who did something similar in his presidency, as opposed to Franklin Roosevelt, for example, who brought in a very fresh team. So the concern here now is that Obama's falling into this trap of bringing in the same people who put us in the position that we're in today, and other people who buy into the same theories that brought us here, this mutant form of capitalism.
Presumably what most politicians want to come in is say, hey, the problems of the past, they're due to the old guy. And I'm cleaning house, and I'm going to bring in a new team, and don't blame us for the things we've inherited. Can't say, you know, those policies of the past that came before were insane, because you got the guy that was one of the key architects of those policies.
People need to stop having allegiance to their political party. They need to have allegiance to the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, and what has made our republic so special. The basic human rights and dignity that every citizen of this country inherently has. Not because it's some right given to us by government, but because our Bill of Rights, our Constitution, enshrines that these are inalienable rights given to us by God, that we inherently have as sentient, free, conscious beings. But instead, the public cheers on the Republicans as they win, or cheers on the Democrats as they defeat the Republicans. It's an endless, staged, gladiatorial event, special interest own both parties, and they project this false left-right paradigm up as like a movie screen. And behind that, behind the throne, the establishment is able to control our society and engineer it into this high-tech police state.
If you try to let the finance oligarchs who created the crisis turn around and say they're the doctors who are going to get you out of the crisis, they will dig you deeper and deeper into the bottomless abyss of world economic depression, financial collapse, and disintegration.
The Democrats have really done more to destabilize the American economy and to help the big banks on Wall Street than the Republicans have done. I would imagine that the Republicans know a little bit more about finance and markets enough that when someone like Goldman Sachs asks the Congress to change laws as they did in the 90s to do away with position limits on the futures contracts, the Republicans would have said, no way, that's completely inconsistent with any notion of a fair market. But the Democrats, I have a feeling, are just not financially literate enough to say no. And I think that Goldman has very shrewdly positioned themselves with the Democrats, because the Democrats typically, like many NGOs that I've run into, they seem to have a complete inability to comprehend these issues of markets and finance and how it relates to social justice. So under the Democrats, we also saw the repeal of Glass-Steagall.
Glass-Steagall said there's an inherent conflict of interest between the commercial banking side, which is the lending side, and the investment banking side, which is taking an ownership position. And we have to end this conflict of interest by separating these two entities. You can have investment banks and you can have commercial banks, but they have to be separate.
Do you think that the repeal of Glass-Steagall was a tragic mistake?
No, I don't think so. You could be a commercial bank like Chase Manhattan, or you could be an investment house like J.P. Morgan, or a bank like Bank of America, or an investment house like Merrill Lynch. But you couldn't be both. And as the 90s went on, the screaming hyenas of Wall Street were demanding that this prohibition, this regulation, be abolished.
This was an illegal and inappropriate form of casino. The derivatives were being used and they were being unregulated, and the people were getting 30 to 1, 40 to 1, 50 to 1, and sometimes 100 to 1 profits on the way up. And remember, derivatives are a zero-sum game. So there's nothing there. It's not like a piece of stock in General Electric or Ford or something like that where there's supposed to be some value. Derivatives have no value. But the very people, Summers and Gettner and all the people at Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan who created these things, made not millions or billions, but trillions on the way up. And now that these things are crashing, the very same folks are now put in charge of regulating these things and in charge of the bailout, and they are giving money to the very rascals that created this problem, took the profits. The problem cannot be fixed. And this is on Obama's watch right now.
You have so many different schemes and mechanisms at play. It's sort of like after there's a blackout, you know, people in some parts of the country have been known to loot the local stores. You know, they go in, they grab the televisions and they grab the stereos. And basically that's what the Wall Street gang has done. They've just engaged in this massive looting of money from their own companies and now from the U.S. Treasury.
There was a lady called Brooksley Born. She was the head of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission under Clinton. And she said, look, we have these derivatives. Why don't we at least make them reportable so we know how many there are and where they are? And she writes in a biographical account, she said, I picked up the phone and Larry Summers was screaming at me that I was interfering with the wonderful inventiveness and ingenuity of Wall Street and their ability to come up with new financial products, such as these derivatives.
Brooksley Born was the chair of the Commodities Future Trading Commission, CFTC, which regulates many financial derivatives. And she said there's a grave danger out there in the form of these credit default swaps. And credit default swaps are an exotic financial derivative, or moderately exotic financial derivative, that were sold on a bright, shining lie that they were supposed to make markets more efficient. In fact, they allow utterly insane gambles, and they're really great devices for accounting fraud as well. She actually says, I'm thinking of adopting this regulation. The Clinton administration goes berserk, and in particular Larry Summers, but also Rubin.
Now behind Larry Summers, there's another layer. Bob Rubin of Goldman Sachs, the Clinton administration, and Citibank. And he also thought that derivatives were a wonderful thing for the U.S. economy, and he made sure that they were never regulated. Also, we can't forget Alan Greenspan over at the Federal Reserve. Now, you look at Summers, he is sitting in the White House today, making policy for Obama. Summers tells Obama what to do. Summers tells Geithner what to do. He's also got some of his hatchet people in the administration. Mary Shapiro runs the Securities and Exchange Commission. She refuses to ban naked short selling and other market manipulations. You've also got another guy called Gensler over at the Commodity Futures Trading Commission today. He is an acolyte and a supporter of the derivatives bubble.
We made the new CFTC chair a guy who had helped to kill Brooksley Born's reform initiatives. And we just did this under the Obama administration.
This was a pre-registered, pre-organized, predetermined event. Anybody who knows that if you allow the banks to become unregulated financial institutes with tsunami-like, weapons of mass destruction-like financial instruments like derivatives, to allow that to run up to levels that are 50, 100, 200 times the gross domestic product with no value. They know that they are taking the profits on going up, but they also know that the end result is the destruction and gutting of this economy.
The scam is simple. The insiders buy hard assets and political influence as the fiat bubbles expand. And then, at a time of their choosing, they purposefully implode the bubble.
You've got a very small group of people, and the Federal Reserve and the global central banking system and the Bank of International Settlements in Switzerland, who are purposefully managing the boom and bust, credit supply, credit contraction, money supply growth, money supply contraction to create artificial roller coasters and artificial volatility that they can trade around without taking any risk. It doesn't cost them any money. And if they do make a mistake because they're, as George Bush said, oh, the bankers on Wall Street are drunk.
It is uncertain. There's no question about it. Wall Street got drunk. That's one of the reasons I should turn off the TV cameras.
Let's say they walk in one day, they push the wrong button, and they lose the bank $1 billion or $5 billion or $100 billion. They can appeal to the government to bail them out. It's a totally asymmetric relationship between bankers and the rest of the economy. If they make a mistake, they get bailed out. If everyone else makes a mistake, they get put in jail, called a terrorist, and we never hear from them again.
But it's a more sophisticated form of slavery, and we're going through it today. We see the taxation is going up all the time with the supposed crash of the banks that was not a happening out of the blue. It was set up for this time. They could have kept it going for another few years if it suited them, and then crashed all the bubbles. But now is the time. As they say in their own writings, now is the time.
One of the great benefits of an economic model from an economist standpoint is you can basically get whatever results you want. You can manipulate the inputs to make that happen. And that makes it a very easy tool to use to hoodwink other people.
These manufactured, these engineered financial catastrophes are the result of a central banking system that has the ability to add and subtract credit, add and subtract dollars and money at will to create this roller coaster effect. Because unlike most people, the banks are able to make profits as easily on the way down as they can on the way up in any given situation. Volatility is great for banks and professionals. Volatility is not great for the most average people.
Their operatives in government and media then hold the economy hostage by issuing the ultimatum: give us unlimited bailout money or the economy dies.
What's being used is what I call, to try to get the money, is what I call the suicide threat, where, you know, if anybody has ever seen the movie Blazing Saddle, the sheriff is surrounded by hostile town folks. He takes out his gun, points it at his head and says, you know, don't move or I'll shoot. Well, that's what the big banks are saying. You know, give us unlimited cash or we'll die. And if we die, you'll die because we're too big to fail.
It is a false flag attack because Hank Paulson will get up in front of Congress and say, we need $700 billion because that thing, that existential threat, the market is attacking us and we need this handout to fight Mr. Market. Mr. Market is out there. We need to fight Mr. Market. It's an existential threat. Meanwhile, he is Mr. Market. He's the one causing the problems.
We had Paulson, a representative of Goldman Sachs who happened to be running the U.S. Treasury, came forward with a hysterical briefing for the Congress saying, we, the Wall Street bankers, demand $700 billion in bailouts.
So they say, yes, we'll give you all the money you need. Well, you know, these are arsonists. Paulson, Tim Geithner, Bernanke, they're arsonists. They're asking for more matches. And the Congress is saying, who do we make the check out to? Who do we send these matches to? Who do we send the matches to? Is a ton of matches enough? Can we send you some gasoline to go with those matches? They're like, yes, please.
Don't change our management. Don't pay us what assets are worth. Pay us way more than what our assets are really worth. Don't make us use honest accounting. Allow us to lie. We've just, under congressional pressure, changed the accounting rules for the express purpose of making sure that the big banks don't have to report honest losses.
The only way they can pass this bill is by creating and sustaining a panic atmosphere. That atmosphere is not justified. Many of us were told in private conversations that if we voted against this bill on Monday, that the sky would fall, the market would drop 2,000 or 3,000 points the first day, another couple thousand the second day, and a few members were even told that there would be martial law in America if we voted no. That's what I call fear-mongering.
We have, you know, people in the government threatening martial law or things to get their way in the executive branch against Congress. You know, if you put all these signs together, it doesn't look good at all. That, to the extent we are a democracy, we're sort of a hairbreadth away from a police state.
Congress aided the bankers in carrying out the biggest heist in history with the so-called banker bailout of 2008.
The bailout money, the $13 trillion or so dollars that have been given to the banks, is sitting on the balance sheet of the banks, and that is incurring interest costs. And that's going to precipitate the need to flush the system with more cash. And at some point, the dam will break, and you're going to have very high inflation. Some predict hyperinflation.
You cannot print phantom money out of thin air, backed by nothing and producing practically nothing without destroying the world economy.
So unless we cut out the toxic funds, the toxic elements of this economy, every time we put in money on this bailout, it's just feeding the fire. It's not making things better.
What should have happened is that those banks and investment banks should have been seized. They should have been seized by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Those are zombie banks. The Chase Manhattan, JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citibank, Wells Fargo, Wachovia, so on down the line, to AIG in the insurance realm. These are zombie institutions, insolvent, bankrupt. The only thing to do with them is to seize them, put them through Chapter 11 bankruptcy. That'll probably turn into Chapter 7 bankruptcy, liquidation. And above all, triage the derivatives on their books. There's no way to bail out a $1.5 quadrillion black hole of derivatives, but nevertheless they tried.
They will, of course, try to regain some of this money back, but their debts, unlike any other period in history, are now a quantum size bigger than the entire global GDP by a factor of 50 to 100. It's almost infinite amount of debt.
If you really look at the numbers, because of the massive, massive debt, and right now, total debt in this country is about 375% of the gross domestic product. And that's not including derivatives. If you put the derivatives in, it's probably 20 to 30 times gross domestic product. It's beyond what anybody has ever even considered.
While they were looting North America into the ground, the international banking syndicate was simultaneously executing the same scam in over 100 other nations.
So who got the money?
To financial institutions in Europe and other countries.
Which ones?
I don't know.
$500 billion and you don't know who got the money?
Well, Obama's got one difficulty with this Congress. It's the number of freshman Democrats that got elected. Many of these people know that they got their seats from, and many of which got seats in the Senate and Congress from long-held Republican seats. They know that the people back in their states and in their constituencies will not tolerate this any longer. So up against the Republicans and the blue dog Democrats are these freshman congressmen, Democratic congressmen and senators, and they're not, they don't seem like they want to go along with the program. So if there's any hope, it'll come from these freshmen.
The Constitution says no money shall be drawn from the Treasury but in consequence of appropriations made by law.
This money is not drawn from the Treasury.
Well, let's talk about that. Do you think it's consistent with the spirit of that provision of the Constitution for a group like the FMOC to hand out $500 billion to foreigners without any action by this Congress?
Congress approved it in the Federal Reserve Act.
When was that?
Quite a long time ago. I don't know the exact date.
100 years ago?
The original act is 1914, I believe. I don't know whether this provision was in 1914 or not, but the Federal Reserve Act was in 1913.
All right, and at that time, the entire gross national product of this country was well under $500 billion, wasn't it?
I don't know.
Is it safe to say that nobody in 1913 contemplated that your small little group of people would decide to hand out $500 billion to foreigners?
What the bailout legislation really did was give a blank check backed up by U.S. taxpayers to offshore megabanks.
Of course, Congress has oversight. If you read the Constitution, our founders were very clear. Anything to do with taxes and money is put into the hands of both houses of Congress together. Both houses of Congress together must approve it. Because it's a buck, because that's why we fought the revolution. Taxation without representation was part of it.
Foreign banks, Société Générale of France, about 10 billion for a French bank. Deutsche Bank of Germany.
Did Deutsche Bank need the money? How much did they get from the bailout? Well, they told us they got $12 billion from the bailout.
And Barclays Bank of Britain, $10 billion. So you're up to almost $50 billion to bail out a series of foreign banks that were derivatives counterparties of AIG, plus Goldman Sachs.
This is the biggest swindle, not only in the history of the United States, this is the biggest swindle and transfer of wealth in the history of the Western countries.
And we've seen all these cronies from Wall Street with the combination to the vaults around the country, and they've just looted the Treasury and the banks and the securities industry dry.
This is by probably an order of magnitude the biggest fraud in history.
Over the next 10 months, $23.7 trillion was stolen from the U.S. Treasury.
The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. McHenry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And the tune of $23.7 trillion worth of taxpayer exposure for the bailouts is quite striking.
The calculation right now is that with Obama, we've got $24 trillion as a line of credit available only to Wall Street banks, insurance companies, credit cards, mutual fund companies, and others, but only financial institutions. $24 trillion of money from the Federal Reserve, from the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and from the Treasury in the form of the bailout of October 2008.
The Federal Reserve, the private holding company for the offshore banks, arrogantly told Congress and the American people that it was none of their business what the private banks did with the people's money.
One very interesting exchange. Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont asking Bernanke, we have given upwards of $2 trillion to various financial institutions. You've got to tell me, where did the money go? And Bernanke simply stonewalls and says, I won't tell you.
And who got the money? Hundreds and hundreds of banks. Any bank or that has access to the U.S. Federal Reserve's discount.
Tell us who they are.
No.
Do you have to be a large, greedy,